All right, so here's the question. Just observing the creativity of both groups, have the furries replaced the LGBTQ? And the whole Q thing, could really add more. I only asked this question because I remember how creative the gay community was way back in the day. As being, kind of an observer of the world around me, and what it was kind of in the 2000s, late 90s to early 2000s. I'd say the blossom that was ages ago, seeds, finally happened probably in the 2000s. And back then, the whole furry thing was super obscure. It was there, but it just wasn't everywhere. Is this the thing, the artistic culture? Now just kind of, the batons kind of changed. Anyhow, this is Freedom Phil. Like, subscribe, let's get into it, and always turn up the video speed. In fact, if you're watching this, which, you should be watching this after I record it, 1.75. I look at it and I think the music, the culture, the party culture that came out of the gay community, it has its rises and falls, and depending on what part of the country you're in, depends on what's going on. One could say San Francisco, just, it's always been there. But mainstream and acceptable culture, because, see, that's the thing about it. When you're still part of the underculture, then it's raw. And then it's like risky and raw. And it's honestly, that's part of what makes something fun, because you're part of a small group of people that are all fighting for what you're aiming for. But I could argue that once gay marriage happened, what should have been perhaps the zenith of the LGBTQ community then kind of hit a flat line, stagnated. And what I find interesting about that is then what's been going on in the last few years when it comes to, and look, if you want to be trans or whatever, cool, do whatever. But I remember old school trans people. I remember the old school gay community and all this stuff, where these people were just fighting for the right to exist in public and not have to hide. And there's something about that fight that makes a warrior's culture, and the art and all the things go along with it. And then once you win, generally there's a subsidence for a while. Well, what's happened in the last few years, one could say maybe this has gone further than expected, and it's actually caused a lot of backlash against the LGBT. So then we see the underculture developing of the furry culture, which is interesting because it has that same kind of wild, crazy energy, of just fun. And by the way, one would say, the same kind of underculture, fashion, elitism as well. And I'm not saying that to be rude, but come on, you can't charge anywhere from $2,000 to $10,000 for an outfit and tell me there isn't some elite action there. It's like, I get it, everything's custom, so that's the way it is. But I see that same type of artistic flower blooming in that culture. And now that it's almost like the same thing you saw in the late 90s, early 2000s with the LGBT, you now see kind of a flowering happening with the furry community, which then leads me to wonder one day, 10, 20 years from now, like 10, 15 years, is it going to be boring? Is it going to be like, oh, your dad's furry convention or something like that? Or, the same way that a lot of the pride marches now are just kind of like, God, it's interrupting traffic. Is that going to be the same thing where now it's really hip, it's really hot, which then leads you to wonder what's going to be the next thing, the next underculture, the next artistic bloom that happens that people can really get behind. Because that's the way I think a lot of things are. And I've said this before, it's like if you go back and you look at the whole beatnik culture, and then there's always normie culture around, but then the kind of hippie culture, followed up by the disco culture. And, like pretty much people fighting, even way back then, fighting for their right to be and do as they want to do, not to be controlled by the masses. So, and one of the funny things about that is you do see kind of insular culture in every small culture as well. I mean, as much as people say, well, we're accepting of everyone, no, you're not. But yeah, you see these different cultures, and you can see like with punk rock as well. And then eventually the subcision of that happens and you go into alternative. I mean, look, you guys remember just a handful of years ago, the whole hipster thing and the skinny jeans and all that crap? That was a thing. And so in the same way, I see some of these undercultures. It's like, what happens when eventually it's been around for like mainstream? Because actually, the furs have been around for ages. It was a lot smaller, and I think internet culture made it, really exploded it. Because let's be honest, most of the things that were edgy back in the day, by the time this new generation came of age, they were kind of boring. So now, what's the new edgy thing? Fox ears and a suit or something like that, and meow. And I got to point this out. I point part of this out because when I was a kid, the goth thing was edgy. Spikes at school. You had like your metal kids, your rocker kids, and sort of like that. And of course, you had country rednecks and whatnot. And then you'd have the little group of kids that was wearing like black leather and spikes, and then had the goth makeup and all that. And that's honestly, to some degree, the same way that like once upon a time it was totally hidden if someone was LGBT. And it was actually a real fight for those people. But then now that all that's pretty much normalized to some degree, it's boring. Well, in the same way that it wasn't so many years ago, I remember if someone was like, "What? The person's they're a furry?" Then you're like, "Say what again?" Now it's kind of everywhere. It's ubiquitous, and I'm wondering if in a few years it'll be like passe. Just like kind of like if you see goth people today, you're like, "Wow, they're still like you." When you see an extinct fashion eventually, like I don't think the furries are going anywhere, and the whole pride thing's not going anywhere either. But it's just not as there's it's like the acid wave. There's people riding the acid wave, and you remember the high water line. And if you know what book that's from, feel free to put it in the comments later. You can see the high water mark where the acid wave hit, and then you may never achieve that again, that zenith. But you see like the last of a species, like of goth people, like someone that's still goth today at the grocery store, and you're like, wow, didn't even know they still existed. Well, that's cool. Anyways, y'all take it easy. It's just some thoughts and ruminations, and peace.